Okay, so I'm going to kick us off, and as folks join, they can join in. My name is Stephanie Foner, and I work on the Affinity and Domestic Engagement team in the Office of Alumni Relations at Northeastern. I work to bring unique and engaging programs just like this one to our Northeastern community. And I am so excited to have you all joining us today for this very special event. So just first, a couple of housekeeping items. A friendly reminder that this event is being recorded for our archive, and we will be sending the recording out to folks probably tomorrow. Please keep your microphone muted throughout the duration of the presentation, just to make sure that we have good sound quality throughout. There will be time at the end for Q&A, and if you could, at the time, put your questions into the chat box, and I'd be happy to read them out loud. Also, I will be keeping an eye on the chat box throughout the presentation, so if you have any questions or any issues pop up, please put them in the chat box, and I will do my best to address them. And now I'd like to introduce our host today, Harriet Booth. Harriet is a marine resource specialist at Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and Woods Hole Sea Grant. She specializes in applied research and educational work focused on shellfish and aquaculture, wild fisheries, and coastal water quality, all of which are integral to stakeholders and the shellfishing industry of Southeastern Massachusetts. Harriet received her Master's of Science from Northeastern in 2017, and she attended Brown University for her undergraduate studies. And now I am very excited to be turning the floor over to Harriet.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here today speaking to you about shellfish and oysters in particular here in Massachusetts. So I'm going to dive right in. And so I am speaking to you from Cape Cod, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with this area. Maybe you've even been to the Cape. But just as a quick review, so Cape Cod is here. It's this peninsula on the easternmost part of the state. It sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. And our office is primarily here in Barnstable. However, I work all over the Cape. So we have field sites across the region. And because Cape Cod is a peninsula, it makes up a large portion of the coastline of the state. So here on the Cape, I work for two groups. I work for Woods Hole Sea Grant, and I work for Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, which is basically Barnstable County is the collection of 15 towns on Cape Cod, so it's a county government position. And for those groups, I'm a marine resource specialist, and that basically means that I conduct research and answer questions about the various resources we have in our coastal waters in the region. So it varies from studying and looking at the water quality, so how clean and healthy our waters are, to studying the organisms, the shellfish that live in those waters. And then I also work closely with the people who use those resources. So that might be fishermen, that might be shellfish farmers, it might be town resource managers, and then the members of the public. So like you and your parents and your family. So I work with those people to make sure they're getting the support they need and that they're also using those resources in a way that's sustainable for the environment and for all of us. So these are just a couple photos of me doing fieldwork as part of my job. So on the left here, this is these are my two coworkers. We work as a 3-person team in the marine program, and we are raking for clams in an experiment we set up. And then here, I am getting ready to deploy some water quality monitoring instruments. And I'll talk a little more about that later on. And both of these photos were taken in Barnstable Harbor. So, before we dive into talking about oysters.
Harriet, I muted you, apologies.
No worries. Can you hear me now? No. So can you hear me, Stephanie?
Yep, you're good, sorry.
Wonderful. So yes, before we talk about oysters specifically, I wanted to talk about shellfish in general in Massachusetts, just to give you a brief overview. So we have oysters here. We actually only have one species of oyster. It's the eastern oyster, Crustaceans virginica. We have a photo here on the right. We have clams here. We have several different kinds of clams. The hard shell clam, which is, we call them quahogs here on the Cape. We have soft shell clams, razor clams, which is this photo here. And then we have a couple other different kinds of clams as well. And we have scallops. We have bay scallops that live in shallower water, close to shore. And then we have sea scallops that live in deeper water, further offshore. And then finally, we have mussels. And we have a couple different kinds of mussels, but primarily we see the blue mussel around here. So we have the photos here on the right. And then the good thing to remember is that all four of these shellfish make up the class bivalves. So the next thing, I wanted to ask you a question. So there'll be a couple different poll questions throughout this presentation, just to keep you guys on your toes and engaged. So I just told you that all four of those shellfish are in the group bivalves. So I wanted to ask you, what common feature do you think all these animals share that define them as bivalves? So go ahead and just pick the answer you think is most accurate. We've got almost everyone. All right. So I think you can see the results here. So everyone got it right, which is awesome. So you guys already know all of this. So the answer is that they have a hinged two-part shell. Here we go. And the other answers actually were correct as well. They all live in water, they all taste good. But the reason they're defined as bivalves is that they have this hinged shell. And the word bivalve actually describes that. So bi means two, and then valve, is anything that can open and close that usually regulates fluid flow. So again, a shell in water, their shell is open and closed. So it's the word really describes that shell that they have. So I have another question for you. What function do you think the shell serves for these animals? So there should be another poll coming up. Maybe. There we go. So go ahead and pick whatever answer you think is best. So we've got a bit of a split so far. All right, looks like that's almost everyone. All right, so really any of these answers would be correct, but the one I was looking for was all of the above. So here we go. So so these shells primarily, they're a housing for these animals, right? They are a hard protective shell that protects them from things like predators, from mechanical damage. If there are rocks in the water, it basically protects that soft internal tissue that are in any shellfish. So protection is a big one, but it does also, by being able to open and close that shell, it can regulate temperature, water flow, etc. It also it can help in moving and swimming. So some species of shellfish, like scallops, can actually move pretty far distances, and they will swim. They'll kind of clap their shells along and swim through the water. They are the most mobile species. So oysters and mussels really don't move much at all. Clams will dig some, but scallops will use their shells to swim. And then, of course, they also, they're a place for muscle attachment. So the way those shells open and close is there is a muscle called the adductor muscle, and it's attached to the shell, and it allows, again, that shell to open and close. So we know that, all about shellfish in general. And now I want to dive into oysters specifically. So we'll just talk about some general biology and ecology before talking a little bit about more specific topics of Cape Cod. So habitat. So where do oysters live? Oysters are fairly tolerant of a wide range of conditions. We know they live in the ocean, at least the species that I'm talking about does here. So they want salt water. But they can live in subtidal environments like this, where they are underwater the whole time. So it means they're basically submerged. They're never exposed to the air. They never go dry. But they can also live in intertidal environments. So here in this photo, you can see this is a huge oyster bed. So these are all oysters, and you can see that they're completely out of the water. So they're exposed to the air. They're completely dry, and they'll remain exposed for the period of that low tide. So when this water comes back up, these oysters will all be covered. But they do fine out of the water. So what they do is they use that shell and they clamp it up, they close it really tightly, and then that allows them to retain moisture in their body. It allows them to, again, kind of keep cool to regulate their temperature. And they can actually survive they can survive for days, and if they're cool, they can actually survive even longer in that kind of hibernation state. But of course, they need water to perform any of their biological functions. So feeding, reproducing, everything like that happens when they're underwater, when they can open and close there. So they are happiest underwater, and they can actually they're tolerant of a wide range of salinities, so how salty the water is. Some of them live in more brackish conditions, which means lower salinity, and some live in very salty ocean water. So they're fairly hardy animals. Now, let's talk about how they reproduce. So the oyster life cycle. Again, I'm giving you the basic overview of oysters as an organism. So here we have a handful of baby oysters, and I'm going to show you a quick video and just talk through it with you guys. And just as a heads up, we will be using reproductive terms in this video and my narration. So this is called the oyster life cycle. Here we go. So like many organisms, oysters only reproduce, which is called spawning here. They only spawn in certain times of the year. So they mainly reproduce in the spring, and that's because the air and the water is warming up, and that warm water signals adult mature oysters to spawn. And basically that means that they release their eggs and sperm right into the water column. And then this video is showing that. And then in the water, the sperm fertilizes the eggs, and they form what's called larvae. And these are basically little free swimming particles, little animals that just swim around in the water. They don't look like adult oysters yet. They don't really look like oysters at all. But they do this for about a couple days. They're just swimming around in the water. And then they grow and they form what's called a D shape. And this is called the D stage. They're still little larvae in the water column. And then after about 2 to 3 weeks, they've gotten bigger and they develop a small muscle called a foot that allows them to settle down to the bottom and attach to some sort of surface. So here you can see this little oyster has settled down and attached to these adult oysters. So I have another question for you, but just before we go on, so oysters can survive, on their own. You'll see many oysters as single animals on the sand and mud in the water, but they also can grow in clusters. So they do like to attach to things like rocks or other oysters or shell of other shellfish. So when they're baby oysters like this, they like to attach to shells and other oysters. So I have a third question for you, and I'm curious how many of you know the answer to this. So once baby oysters have set, so that means they've settled down and they've attached to some sort of hard surface, what are they called? And there are 4 answers here. Go ahead and pick whatever you think is correct. Oh, we've got a big split. This is fun. All right, looks like we've got almost all of you. Okay. So, yes, the correct answer is spat. So that is the majority answer, but a lot of you guys guessed some of the other answers, which is fine. But I actually had fun coming up with those other words. So like oysterling is not a biological term, but so the baby oysters are called spat, which is one of my favorite, fun facts about oysters. Oops, there we go. So again, at this stage, these are little baby oysters, and you can see at this point, they actually look like adult, they have a shell. They look like mini versions of adult oysters. So they're called spat until they're about, maybe an inch or so, inch and a half in length. And then they're just, juvenile oysters, small oysters. So moving on. So where oysters live, how they reproduce. And now we're going to talk about something really important. We're going to talk about what oysters eat. And you can think of oysters as nature's vacuum cleaners, and I will explain why. So here in this photo on the left, you can see that someone is vacuuming a carpet, right? So on the left side of that picture, the carpet is brown and dirty. It's full of dirt and different particles. And that vacuum cleaner is basically sucking those particles out of the carpet and leaving a clean white carpet behind. And that's basically what oysters do when they feed in the water. So here on the right, you see this, this cluster of oysters underwater. You can see that water around those oysters is pretty green and murky. And so when oysters feed, they basically pump water into their body, and they have gills, and those gills are covered with tiny hairs called cilia. And as they pump water over their gills, the cilia capture all the particles within the water. So whether it's, bits of debris, bits of dirt, microscopic plants, algae, they basically, trap all those particles and remove them from the water. And then they're pumping the rest of the water right out. So basically they're filtering in water, they're feeding, and then the water they pump back out is going to be much cleaner because they've removed all those particles. So, and they do primarily, so the food they want is called phytoplankton, and those are little microscopic plants. But of course, when they pump in, when they trap particles that they don't actually want to eat, they can still, they filter them in, and then they basically turn them into waste, what's called pseudofeces. So they will only actually ingest what will allow them to grow and be healthy. So in this way, they feed on through pumping water into their systems. All right, and so we call them filter feeders. And I wanted to ask you another poll question. So this is a fun one. How many gallons of water do you think an adult oyster can filter in one day? All right, we've got a couple different answers. Oh, no one's going for the low guess. All right, looks like we have almost everyone. So this is a pretty even split. The correct answer is actually up to 50 gallons. So here we go. So if you think about it, an oyster is a pretty small animal, and they can filter a huge amount of water per day. They don't always necessarily filter that every day, but they are quite capable of doing that. So they can filter up to 50 gallons a day. If you think about that, you might have a gallon of milk in your fridge, and that's a heavy container. That's a lot of liquid. So this small animal can filter 50 of those in a day. So because they can filter such a large volume of water, and because they can clean that water as they're feeding, they actually can have a large impact on the quality and health of our coastal waters. So, and to clarify, when I talk about water quality here, I'm talking about how much natural growth is in the water. So things, like microscopic plants and algae, like I talked about. So I'm not talking about toxins and contaminants, things like, plastics and trash in the ocean. So right now we're talking about them filtering out kind of that natural growth. So what happens here is that in areas where there are a lot of humans on the coastline, so like Cape Cod, there can be a lot of excess nitrogen, which is a nutrient, It's a natural nutrient, but it can basically run off for a variety of reasons into our coastal waters. And that stimulates a huge amount of growth because, nitrogen is a nutrient that plants need and, all of us need to survive. It's natural. But if you have too much nitrogen, it can create a huge amount of growth. And that can lead to things like algae blooms. So just, huge masses of plants that have, grown from all this nitrogen and they're in our coastal areas. I'm sure some of you have seen some of these algal blooms. And that can actually have very negative effects on our coastal areas. So those big, blooms of algae and plants they can suffocate other plants and animals. They can block light in the water. They can reduce the amount of oxygen available. So that excess nitrogen, mainly from human activities, it has very negative impacts on our coastal waters. And because oysters can kind of clean that water and that those nutrients, that nitrogen is what's fueling plants, which is what those oysters can filter out. Oysters can kind of help us clean that water. And some people kind of think of them as a potential solution to this kind of nutrient loading issue we have. But they won't be able to solve the whole problem. So as humans, we need to reduce the amount of nitrogen we are loading into the system. And that's primarily, it's coming from things like our septic systems, from fertilizer that we use on our lawns, waste from animals that we raise on farms. So that's a big issue that we're going to have to solve. But oysters are there and they can kind of help mitigate that at a certain level. So these photos are just showing some of the water quality work that I do. So every year, for most of the year, I have instruments deployed at 5 sites all over Cape Cod. And this is what they look like. And they collect data on oxygen, on pH, temperature, salinity, basically everything we would want to know about water to figure out how healthy it is and how clean it is. So we have a huge data set of all that, and we can monitor that over time and make sure our waters are staying clean and healthy, and also assess how they are for our shellfish populations, because of course, water quality is very closely tied to shellfish health. So here I'm going to play another video for you guys. And this is just a demonstration. Let's see. There we go. This just shows you how fast oysters can filter and what an impact they can have on water. So these are 2 tanks. The one on the left has no oysters in it. The one on the right is full of adult oysters. And look at this. So it's been less than half an hour, if you look at the clock here, and that water is already clearing up. So those oysters, you can't tell, but they're filtering this whole time. And because there's so many oysters in there, you look at that, it took less than an hour for that water to almost be clear. So let's skip ahead a little bit. So this is about an hour and a half, and that water is completely clear. So compare that to this tank here, which has no oysters, and you can see, so they can really make a big difference filtering out, different particles and algae in the water. So we're switching gears a little bit. So we know now what oysters eat and how they can impact our water quality in coastal areas. So now let's talk about predators. So who eats oysters? This is another important topic. So pretty much, most of the bigger organisms you see around our Massachusetts coastline will eat small oysters. So we have green crabs, we have blue crabs, we have many other species of crabs. We have seabirds, and we have fish. And I will say, so all of these can prey on oysters. They do generally target smaller sized oysters. And that's of course because smaller oysters have, smaller shell. It's more delicate, it's easier, for instance, for a crab to crush, and eat the insides. It's easier for a bird to break open. But of course, the bigger the predator is, the bigger oyster they can eat. So they will prey on all sizes of oysters. We also have snails. So you might not think that snails can eat shellfish, but we have some voracious predators. These here on the top, these are oyster drills. And here on the bottom, this is a moon snail. And what these snails do is they actually, these oyster drills are tiny. They're only about 1 inch or 2 long, but they drill a hole through the shell of both oysters and clams, and they kill and consume the oyster tissue through that hole. So it's pretty impressive. And you can actually, if you go on the beach and you find, different clam and oyster shells, you can often find this hole and know that, an oyster gill or a moon snail probably killed and ate that oyster. So, and they're actually, oyster drills especially are one of our biggest predators of oysters around here. So, and of course, humans eat oysters too. So we love eating oysters, especially in Massachusetts, especially on Cape Cod. People eat them in all different ways. So we have, oysters on the half shell, baked oysters, fried oysters. People eat them in stew. And you can harvest oysters or grow oysters in different ways. So, so here on the left, we have people, these are likely recreational shellfishers, and they are raking for oysters in the wild. So this is, they're wild harvesting. These oysters have grown naturally. And these people, you do need a permit and, a correct permission to go harvest oysters. And then here on the right, we have a commercial shellfish farm. So this is a farmer. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but he is growing those oysters. So there's wild harvest and there's, farm raised oysters basically. So we're going to talk about aquaculture next. So aquaculture is the farming of aquatic organisms, including fish, mollusks, crustaceans, and aquatic plants. So that's the definition of aquaculture. And here we have several different photos that depict that. So we have, this is a mussel farm here. These are long lines in deep water. And these are all mussels. These are covering these lines and someone's growing those when they'll harvest them. We have a fish farm, which is more common. We have seaweed. So a lot of people are growing seaweed now. And then of course we have shellfish. So it's interesting to think about aquaculture is very, very similar to agriculture, so land farming. And of course, when we think of a farm, we think of a farm on land generally. So, a farm with rich soil that the plants grow in. We have, livestock that we raise that maybe graze on grass and, they're out in pastures. So we think about all those farming techniques on land. But aquaculture is actually the exact same thing, but it's in water. And it's, of course, raising plants and animals that grow in water. So things like, again, fish, seaweed, shellfish. But it's the same thing where, these plants are getting the nutrients they need from the soil and they're getting their sunlight. And then, seaweed and plants in water are getting the nutrients they need from water and they're getting their light. And things like oysters are pretty much the same as cows. They're grazing the phytoplankton out of the water, just like a cow grazes on the grass on land. So it's a very, very similar process. And that's a good thing to remember going forward. So like I mentioned, oyster farming is a type of aquaculture. And here we have a couple photos. So on the left, these are what look like market-sized oysters. So the farmer is going through them right now. And here we have the same picture. So these are all, these are lines of oyster bags that are all anchored to this rack. And again, there's probably oysters of all different sizes in there, and the farmer's growing those to sell. So because we love eating oysters, they're popular to grow. So there are a lot of shellfish farms on the Cape. We actually have over 300 licensed aquaculture sites on the Cape. And oysters make up 94% of shellfish aquaculture in the state. So despite being able to grow, clams and scallops and, mussels, pretty much everyone is preferring to grow oysters. And that's because, they're a really great product. They grow fast. There's lots of methods about how to do that well. And they're also extremely valuable. So this graph is just showing the steady increase in value of oysters over the last 10 years. So oysters are the blue bars here and quahogs are the orange bars. And it's just showing that from 2011 to 2019, every year, the value of oyster aquaculture increased. So it's just showing you how much it's a really booming industry. So, everyone wants to eat oysters and everyone's growing oysters. So here we just have a farmer. Here he's got his different shellfish in the bags here. And And this is in Massachusetts specifically. So aquaculture will of course vary around the country, will vary in different states, but here in Massachusetts, oysters have become very popular. So because we have so many different farms and we have, so many different people growing oysters, there are multiple ways to grow them, and they all work depending on your growing conditions and your site. So it depends on many factors, but we'll talk about a couple of them. So we have what's called bottom culture. And this is when farmers basically free plant their oysters on the bottom, in the mud and sand on the bottom of the ocean, usually in intertidal areas. So this picture is showing farmers harvesting those oysters that they just planted on their site. And then we have what's called, bottom culture in bags. So this is very popular. These again are all bags that are anchored on lines, and they're anchored to the bottom of to the mud and sediment, and they're full of oysters. And this of course allows, it protects those oysters from predators because they're in the bags. It of course contains those oysters, so the farmer, knows where they are, knows how many he has. So that's a popular way to grow them. And of course, this site, most of these pictures are at low tide. So like I mentioned, oysters do fine when they are out of the water, but they of course need to be under the water at least half the time. So this is showing this is maybe a mid tide, and at high tide, all of these areas would be covered with water. So we just have a couple more photos here. You can see in the left picture, these bags are pretty full of large oysters. So these are likely, close to harvest size and ready for the farmer to sell them. And then we have a big tray of oysters here, which can also be used to grow them. So next we have off-bottom culture. So there are various methods within this larger category, but a really popular method is this rack and bag system. And it looks similar to what we saw before, but it's a little different. So you can see there's a prominent rack that's about a foot off the sediment, and the different oyster bags and these square oyster bags are anchored to that rack. And that basically allows, gets them off the sediment in case there are, some predators just stay on the sediment. And so it, might protect them a little more from those predators. It allows more water flow. So they have water flowing, on all sides. And it's a preference between farmers of, what conditions work best for their growing area. They can also be grown in trays. Same thing, these trays are on racks above the bottom of above the sediment. And again, full of oysters. And then we also have cages. So bags within cages are another way to keep those bags off the surface. And it's a popular growing method. And then finally, we have suspended culture. So this uses some of the same equipment. So these are all those same oyster bags that we've been seeing, but they're held up by buoys or by some sort of flotation device. And so these bags are floating on the water. Here you can see these long lines. This is an oyster farm here. And these are all full of oysters. And these are floating cages. And primarily this is done in slightly deeper water. So some sites farmers can only access by boat. Sometimes they never go dry. Some sites farmers can wade out to at low tide. So it depends on the conditions in an area and a preference and logistically what a farmer can do. But all these methods work equally well, depending on conditions. This is a couple different farm sites. You can see there's one over here, one here. And these are likely all oyster bags being grown there. And then we have cages, 2 lines of cages. And here we have floating baskets. Like I mentioned before, these right now, this is low tide, but these baskets are just suspended from this line. And at high tide, they're in the water, getting tumbled around, getting lots of water flow to those animals. So this can be a popular way to grow them as well. So we're getting to the end here. So I've talked about all these different growing methods. And of course, the purpose of these farms right now is to harvest and sell those oysters. So this is the final question. And I'm wondering how many of you know the legal harvest size of oysters in Massachusetts? Looks like we have a couple popular answers. All right, almost all of you, a couple more. All right. You guys are a savvy crew. You know a lot about oysters. So yeah, so if you guessed 2.5 or 3 inches, you are actually correct. So for wild harvest, so if you, like I said, if you're raking those, the picture we saw, if you're raking those oysters from the bottom and they were grown in the wild, 3 inches is the minimum size you can harvest them at. But if you are a commercial shellfish farmer, you can harvest them at 2.5 inches. They're called petite oysters. And again, that's only if you have a commercial farm, you have the license and you're set up to do that. And here we just have some photos of, these are likely about market size oysters. So just to conclude, I know I've talked to you a lot about the biology and ecology of oysters, talked about aquaculture and growing them. And again, aquaculture is a huge focus of, it's a huge industry here on the Cape. It's a big part of my job. And so just to reiterate, so I focus a lot on supporting these, these users of shellfish. So these harvesters, these growers, we have so many aquaculture, we have so many farmers on the Cape. And while I'm supporting those users, I'm also focusing on conserving those resources and making sure that we create a sustainable economy and environment for Massachusetts communities. And just to finish up, so these 2 photos show, again, myself and a colleague, and this is a clam farmer in Provincetown. And what we're doing here is we set up an experiment here on his site to look at growth rates of different surf clams. And I just wanted to point this out because it sums up a lot of our work. So our work is extremely interactive. We work with those shellfish farmers and harvesters. So we do a lot of collaborative work, and we're answering questions that directly inform industry members. So this farmer, he grows clams. He's interested in knowing, maybe what will grow better in different conditions. And so we have, funding to help him answer that question. And we work collaboratively. And again, that research, the results that we find from our various projects can be used directly by people who need that information. So it's a really satisfying way to do research and to work with different people in the community. So that is all I have for you today. And I'm happy to take any final questions. And I have a few more fun facts about oysters, if you guys want to read them over and impress people. But yeah, Stephanie, that is all I have.
Great. So we have a couple questions in the chat box already, so that gives the rest of you some time to start thinking about your own questions for Harriet as well. So I will first start us off. We have a question. Are these shellfish, oysters, and clams, are they generally found on the bay side of the Cape rather than the ocean side of the Cape?
They are fine. They're found in both. So again, it depends. There's so much variation in little embayments and beaches and all that, but you can definitely find oysters on both sides. You can find clams on both sides. It depends more on the sediment type. So again, rather than whether it's the ocean or bay side, it's more dependent on whether they're good, it's good habitat for shellfish. So that will determine, what you find in different areas more than the general location.
Oh, this is a good question. What are the differences between oysters, scallops, and mussels?
Oh, well, they're different species of animals, and they have, so let's see, they have subtle differences. So they are all shellfish, but like I said, so scallops, for instance, have totally different movement patterns than both mussels and oysters. They I don't have a video for you, but they clap along and swim. They all eat very similar things. So they're all filter feeders. That's a common feature. But mussels, there's a big difference in mussels in that they produce what's called byssal threads. So they produce this really strong thread that they use to anchor themselves. So they have subtle differences that do define them as different species, but they also have a lot of commonalities. So they're all, filter feeders. They all have the shell. They all reproduce in a similar way. So they're similar, but like lots of species, they have those differences.
With warming waters on the Cape and elsewhere, has the harvest or even just like the growth and reproduction patterns of these shellfish been detrimentally impacted?
That's a great question. So we do notice, differences in general. So we, myself and my colleagues have data that goes back, 20 years from various things, water quality, growth rates in shellfish, et cetera. So we do see changes. I wouldn't say we can correlate anything specifically to temperature change right now, but there are definitely, it's having an impact. So a big thing we're seeing is some movement in species distributions. So that last slide I showed, which showed myself and my colleague doing a growth rate experiment between two types of surf clams. We are actually doing that experiment because one of them is a warmer water species and one is a colder water species. And we're seeing if that warmer water species will do better as our summers get warmer and warmer. So whether they'll grow better. So again, we're not seeing any dramatic changes yet, but we're seeing small significant differences, and we'll likely see more of them as we go forward. And I will say a lot of my work recently has focused on ocean acidification. So that, of course, will affect shellfish because they're using calcium carbonate to make their shell. And so I do work a lot with growers who are concerned about their sites becoming acidic and maybe affecting their shellfish. So that's another up and coming stressor.
What is your favorite part about your job?
That's a good question. My favorite part is definitely the field work. So being able to work outside, I work inside plenty, but during, from May through October, I do a lot of, outside experiment and different surveys. And then I also have really great coworkers. So I would say working with people who, inspire you and who are exciting and hard workers, that's really important. And that, it's a big part of the job.
Can you discuss if there are volunteer oyster and clam seeding activities in support of your work?
Let's see. So we don't, in our program, we don't specifically have any volunteer opportunities, but Cape Cod in general has a lot of different volunteer positions. So actually all the towns, this is interesting. So all the towns on the Cape, I mentioned there are 15 of them. Almost all of them have what's called a shellfish propagation program. And that basically means that they have town funding to purchase seed. So, oyster and clam seed or whatever they want to buy, and grow that and boost their town population so that the public can harvest recreationally. And I will say in those propagation programs, they have a lot of volunteer opportunities. And that's doing things like working at an upweller. So, helping grow seed and all that. So I would definitely reach out to town resource departments, natural resource departments, and see if they have opportunities.
Can you talk a little more about the process of, I think it's, the question is around growing oysters. So I assume that's the aquaculture and the aqua farming that you spoke about. Mm-hmm. Is it basically recreating the natural growth of oysters? Are there some other components that go into that process?
That's a great question. So the nice thing about growing oysters is that they get all the food they need from the water. So again, it's like growing lettuce, as if even if you didn't have to fertilize any of your land plants, they get all the nutrients they need from the soil, from the sun. And so oysters are the same way. They get all the food they need as long as they have adequate water flow and as long as they're in water that is productive enough to have the food they need. So farmers do not, they don't give them any additional food when they're adults. They also don't, you can't use any, antibiotics or any kind of, chemical or whatever you might use that's not natural. You can't, of course, use those in these open water environments. So it's a very it's not low maintenance in that it's a lot of labor, but farmers are not, adding much to what oysters get from the water. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Now, this is a question around seasonality and the tastiness of oysters.
Mhm.
Um, in the warmer months, does or the temperature of the water or how much water there is, does this impact the flavor and the eating experience of oysters?
Yes, so clearly this person is an oyster connoisseur. Yes, so it will impact it. So, like I said, oysters, people have different opinions, and it depends on region. But generally, when oysters are spawning, so when they're reproducing in the spring, they go through a period where they're allocating all their energy to reproducing, and then they reproduce, and then in the summer, right after that, they don't have as much tissue. They might not taste as good because they've released all the energy they've built up. And then in the fall, they've kind of quote unquote fattened back up. So generally the fall is thought to be, when oysters are kind of, maybe the tastiest, maybe you get the most tissue within an oyster. And then of course, I think the flavor it varies by the water body that those oysters are in. So that, different farms will advertise, different flavors of their oysters because of the different, nutrients or different conditions in their water. So it will vary by the water body that they're in.
And I think last call for questions. I have a question. I would love for you to share with us your and how you ended up in your current role and your Northeastern experience.
Yeah. So I got my master's at Northeastern, and it was in the marine ecology program. So I did all my work up in Nahant, so up at the Marine Science Center. I have been interested in marine biology for a long time. So I actually, my undergrad was focused on marine science as well. So I kind of knew coming out of college that I wanted to go to graduate school for that. And then how I got this job specifically, I have done a lot of research in different coastal environments around New England. I've worked a lot with shellfish in the past, studying various things about them. I did research on oysters for part of my master's. So that all helped me. I had a couple jobs before this out of graduate school, but they were all related to shellfish in some way. So it kind of helped get me this position, which is focused on shellfish, but it also incorporates, a huge amount of other topics and other, we do research, we do education, we do outreach about kind of everything surrounding our coasts, which of course does involve a lot of shellfish. So that's the quick summary of how I got here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Harriet. So appreciative of you taking the time to put this together and sharing your knowledge and your perspective with us. Hopefully we'll be able to visit you in person one day with our Cape Cod community volunteers and members.
That would be great. And yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you all for listening.